The rain had been relentless for days, an unending downpour that swallowed the horizon and turned familiar landscapes into something unrecognizable. What had started as a few harmless puddles quickly morphed into rivers coursing through fields and valleys, devouring everything in their path. In a quiet rural town surrounded by sprawling pastures, the floodwaters rose so quickly that even the animals usually attuned to the rhythms of nature were caught off guard. People were scrambling to save what they could, their homes, their belongings, and above all, their lives. Yet, amidst this chaos, one particular horse became the center of a story no one would ever forget. The horse had always been a source of pride in the small community. Strong, spirited, and fiercely intelligent, it was a creature that inspired awe. Everyone knew it as a gentle giant, a loyal companion to the farmer who had raised it since it was a foal. But as the floodwaters surged that fateful morning, the horse's calm existence was shattered. It was trapped, stranded in a pocket of land that had been completely encircled by the angry, swirling current. The barn it had once called home was now a crumbling wreck, half submerged, while the vast pasture where it used to roam freely had vanished beneath the murky floodwaters. There was no way to reach it safely, at least, none that anyone could see. The farmer, exhausted from hours of battling the rising water to secure his family and livestock, stood helpless on the edge of the torrent. His voice cracked as he shouted the horse's name over and over, hoping against hope that it would somehow find a way to escape. But the animal was stranded, perched precariously on a small patch of dry land that was rapidly shrinking. Its eyes, wide with fear, scanned the chaos around it. The current was too strong, the water too deep. Even the bravest of creatures wouldn't dare venture into that deadly expanse. Word of the trapped horse spread quickly. Neighbors arrived, their faces etched with concern, but no one had a solution. Boats couldn't navigate the debris-filled waters, and the helicopter rescue teams were already overwhelmed with emergencies elsewhere. Time was running out, and the odds of survival were dwindling. People tried to think of ways to help. Some suggested building a makeshift bridge, others thought of luring the horse with food, but every idea seemed impossible in the face of the raging flood. The tension was unbearable. Was this how it would end? Would the beloved horse be claimed by the unforgiving waters? The animal, as if sensing the desperation of the crowd, let out a piercing whinny that cut through the noise of the storm. It wasn't just a cry of fear, it was something more, something defiant. The horse pawed at the wet ground beneath it, its powerful body tense with energy, as though it was weighing its options. The onlookers held their breath. Could it actually understand the danger it was in? Was it trying to save itself? Or was it simply reacting to the primal instinct to survive, the one thing that unites all living beings in the face of death? As the minutes dragged on, the floodwaters showed no mercy, rising inch by inch and threatening to engulf what little ground the horse had left. The farmer's hands clenched into fists, his heart pounding with helpless frustration. He had raised this animal, cared for it, trusted it. But now, there was nothing more he could do. It was all up to the horse. What happened next defied every expectation. It was a moment so extraordinary, so inexplicable, that those who witnessed it would struggle to describe it in the days and weeks that followed. The horse seemed to make a decision, a choice that no one could fully understand. It turned its head toward the rushing water, nostrils flaring, muscles coiled like springs. And then, as if driven by some unseen force, it did something no one saw coming. The horse's sudden shift in demeanor rippled through the onlookers. Its movements were deliberate, its gaze fixed on the waters with a kind of determination that felt almost human. People murmured anxiously, unsure of what they were witnessing. Was it preparing to leap? To make a desperate attempt at freedom? The very idea seemed impossible. The current was far too strong, carrying broken branches, fencing, and debris from miles away. Even the best swimmers would struggle to survive in such conditions, and this was no gentle creek, it was a churning, unpredictable force of nature. Yet the horse stood there, muscles taut, as though weighing its chances. It was in that suspended moment, where time felt both frozen and fleeting, that the farmer's mind began to wander. He thought about how it all began, how this extraordinary animal had come into his life. Years ago, when he first laid eyes on the young foal, it had been scrawny and unremarkable. No one at the auction had paid it much attention, dismissing it as just another horse with no pedigree or promise. But there had been something about the way it carried itself, a quiet resilience that caught his eye. He didn't need another horse at the time. His stable was already full, but he couldn't walk away. Against all logic, he placed a bid, and to his surprise he won. That horse had turned out to be more than just an investment. It became a companion, a partner in the long, grueling days of farm work. There was something almost uncanny about how it seemed to understand him, responding to his commands with an intelligence that went beyond training. Over the years, their bond had deepened. The horse had proven its worth time and time again, pulling through in moments of crisis when machinery failed or bad weather struck. It wasn't just an animal to him, it was family. The farmer's thoughts were interrupted by a sharp gasp from someone in the crowd. The horse had taken a step closer to the water, its hooves sinking slightly into the mud. The movement was cautious, almost hesitant, but it sent a ripple of panic through the spectators. "It's going to try!" someone shouted, their voice trembling. "It's going to jump!" The farmer's heart lurched. He wanted to call out, to tell the horse to stay put, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? What could anyone do? The situation felt utterly hopeless, yet he couldn't tear his eyes away. As the rain continued to pour, the scene grew more surreal. The sky, a dull gray canvas streaked with black clouds, seemed to press down on them, amplifying the weight of the moment. The horse stood at the very edge of its tiny island, its mane plastered against its neck by the relentless downpour. Its ears twitched, listening to something only it could hear. For a moment, it looked back toward the farmer, and their eyes met. The farmer swore there was something in that gaze, a flicker of trust, of connection, as if the horse was saying, "I'll try, but I need you to believe in me." The crowd fell silent as the horse took another step, its hoof dipping into the water this time. The current pushed against it immediately, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed as though the animal might lose its footing. But it held steady, adjusting its stance with a grace that belied its massive frame. The farmer's breath caught in his chest. He felt utterly powerless, yet somehow, he couldn't look away. The horse was doing something no one had dared to imagine. It was testing the waters, literally and figuratively. Meanwhile, whispers of the trapped horse had reached even farther corners of the town. More people arrived, braving the storm to witness what had now become a spectacle. Some came out of genuine concern, while others were simply curious. But regardless of their reasons, they all stood shoulder to shoulder in the rain, united by the same question: could the horse possibly survive this? Among them was an older man who had once been a horse trainer. His weathered face was lined with years of experience, and he watched the scene intently. "It's not just instinct," he muttered to no one in particular. "That horse is thinking. It knows what it's up against." The trainer's words carried weight, though few dared to hope he was right. As the minutes ticked by, the tension grew unbearable. The horse continued to inch forward, testing the depth and strength of the water with every step. The flood was merciless, rising steadily and erasing what little ground remained. There was no turning back now. Whatever the horse decided to do, it had to happen soon or not at all. The farmer's mind raced as he watched, torn between hope and dread. He thought about the years they had spent together, the countless hours of work, the quiet moments of companionship. He remembered the time the horse had nudged him awake during a late-night storm, warning him of a broken fence that had allowed the livestock to wander. Or the time it had stood protectively by his young daughter when she had tripped and fallen in the pasture, refusing to move until help arrived. This horse wasn't just smart, it was extraordinary. But was that enough to save it now? The horse took another step, its body leaning into the current. The water surged around its legs, threatening to sweep it away, but it held firm. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their collective breaths held as though releasing them might break the fragile balance. And then, without warning, the horse moved again, this time with purpose. It plunged forward, muscles rippling as it pushed against the current. The water rose to its chest, then its shoulders, and still, it kept going. Every step seemed like an impossible battle, yet the horse refused to falter. The farmer's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to shout encouragement, to do something, anything, but he was frozen, caught in the grip of the moment. The horse was in the fight of its life, and all he could do was watch. The current swirled around it, a chaotic force that seemed determined to drag it under. Yet somehow, the horse pressed on, its movements deliberate and focused. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices carrying over the roar of the flood, but the battle was far from over. The water grew deeper, the obstacles more treacherous. And as the horse struggled onward, it became clear that this was more than just a fight for survival. It was a test of will, of determination, of something far greater than anyone could have imagined. But what drove the horse to take such a risk? Was it instinct, courage, or something else entirely? That question lingered in the minds of everyone who watched, adding another layer of mystery to an already extraordinary scene. And as the horse pushed forward, its body trembling with effort, the answer seemed tantalizingly out of reach. The horse's struggle against the floodwaters was unlike anything the crowd had ever seen. Every movement it made seemed impossibly deliberate, each step a battle against forces that could easily overpower it. The current clawed at its legs, the debris-laden water threatening to knock it off balance. Yet the horse pushed forward, its eyes focused, its ears twitching as though listening to some invisible guide. It wasn't just surviving, it was fighting, resisting the pull of the storm with a kind of resolve that left everyone speechless. The farmer's chest felt tight as he watched, unable to look away. It wasn't just fear he felt, it was something deeper, something that twisted in his gut and sent his thoughts spiraling in every direction. He thought about how this flood had turned his world upside down in the span of hours. The rising waters had taken so much, his crops, his barn, pieces of his life that he might never get back. And now, the horse, the one constant in all his years on the farm, was out there, fighting to survive. The helplessness gnawed at him, but beneath it was something else, a faint flicker of hope, fragile but stubborn, refusing to die. The storm raged on, the rain pelting down with unrelenting force. The crowd that had gathered on the edge of the water seemed rooted in place, their umbrellas and raincoats no match for the deluge. No one spoke anymore, all their attention was fixed on the horse. Even the kids, usually so restless, stood in stunned silence. It was as if the animal's struggle had cast a spell over everyone, pulling them into its world and making them feel its fight. Among the crowd was a young boy clutching his mother's hand. He had been the first to notice the horse that morning, tugging at her sleeve and pointing toward the rising water. Now, his wide eyes never left the animal. He had always loved horses, though he'd never been brave enough to go near one. Something about their size, their power, had always intimidated him. But this horse, it wasn't just powerful. It was something else entirely. In that moment, the boy felt a strange connection, as if the horse's fight was his own. He whispered to his mother, his voice barely audible over the storm, "Do you think it's scared?" His mother didn't answer right away. She didn't know what to say. But the question lingered, not just for her, but for everyone watching. Was the horse scared? Was it driven by fear, or by something stronger, something more profound? The thought unsettled her, as if it pointed to something deeper, something no one could quite explain. Meanwhile, the old horse trainer who had been watching from the sidelines stepped forward, his boots sinking into the mud. His years of experience told him that what he was witnessing wasn't just instinct. He'd trained dozens of horses in his lifetime, but none like this. There was something in the way it moved, the way it tested the water and adjusted its body to the current. "It's thinking," he muttered again, this time louder, as if to convince himself. "That horse isn't just reacting. It's planning." His words caught the attention of a woman standing nearby, a local wildlife biologist who had come to the scene after hearing about the trapped animal. She'd spent years studying animals in their natural habitats, documenting their behaviors and instincts. But this was different. She had always believed in the intelligence of animals, but the horse's actions seemed almost calculated, as though it understood the stakes. She pulled out her phone, not to record but to take notes. If the horse survived, this moment would become a story worth telling, not just for the people who had gathered, but for anyone who underestimated the depth of an animal's will to live. The horse's movements grew more labored as the water rose higher. The current was relentless now, wrapping around its chest and pulling hard with every step. Every so often, the animal would pause, its body trembling with exertion. Each pause felt like an eternity, the crowd collectively holding its breath, afraid that the next step might be its last. But then, with a surge of effort, the horse would push forward again. Its nostrils flaring, its eyes blazing with something that looked like defiance. The farmer's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. He'd always prided himself on being able to keep his emotions in check. Farm life demanded it. But now, he felt as though he might burst. His mind raced with questions. Was there something he could do? Should he wade into the water, try to reach the horse himself? The thought was absurd. He wouldn't make it 5 feet before the current dragged him under. Still, the helplessness was unbearable. "Come on," he whispered under his breath, though the words were lost in the roar of the storm. "You can do it." And then there were the bystanders who couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this moment than met the eye. A man who had driven in from the next town over after hearing about the horse muttered to himself, "It's almost like it knows we're watching. Like it's trying to prove something." The idea seemed ridiculous, but no one could entirely dismiss it. There was something about the horse's struggle that felt larger than life, as if it carried a weight beyond its own survival. The biologist, still scribbling notes on her phone, began to wonder about the horse's past. What had shaped it into the creature it was today? Animals weren't born brave, they became brave through experience, through the challenges they faced and overcame. Had this horse faced dangers before? Had it learned to survive against the odds? She made a mental note to ask the farmer about its history if no, when it made it out. As the horse continued its slow, agonizing journey, the crowd's emotions became a mix of hope and dread. Every small victory, a step forward, a moment of steady footing, was met with murmurs of encouragement, while every stumble drew gasps of fear. The horse's struggle was their struggle now, its fight a reflection of their own fears and hopes. It was more than just an animal in a flood. It was a symbol, a reminder of resilience, of what it meant to keep going when everything seemed stacked against you. But as the water climbed higher and the debris became more dangerous, the tension in the air thickened. The horse's strength was incredible, but it wasn't infinite. The farmer knew this better than anyone. He had seen animals pushed to their limits before, and he knew the signs. The trembling legs, the labored breaths, it was all there. The horse was giving everything it had, but how much longer could it last? The old trainer seemed to sense the same thing. "It's close to its breaking point," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. But even as he said it, he couldn't help but marvel at the animal's spirit. Most horses would have given up by now, he thought. But not this one. This one had something special. The biologist looked up from her notes, her brow furrowed. "If it's going to make it," she said softly, "it's going to need more than strength. It's going to need a miracle." And as the horse pushed forward once more, the crowd couldn't help but wonder, was a miracle even possible in a storm like this? The storm showed no sign of letting up. The rain lashed down harder, and the wind whipped through the air, carrying with it a biting chill. The horse was now chest-deep in the floodwaters, its movements slower but no less determined. The crowd's nerves were frayed to the breaking point, their faces a mix of awe and anguish as they watched the animal fight against what seemed like inevitable defeat. Each step forward was hard-earned, each pause filled with the crushing weight of uncertainty. The farmer could feel his pulse in his ears, his heart pounding like the rhythm of a drum. Every instinct in his body told him to do something, anything, to help the horse. But what could he do? Wading in would only put them both at risk, and calling for more help would take too long. He clenched his fists tighter, frustration boiling in his chest. He hated feeling useless, hated the idea that his companion, the creature he had trusted and cared for, was out there alone, battling forces no one could control. The horse stopped again, its head dipping slightly as if to catch its breath. The crowd collectively tensed, the silence almost as deafening as the storm. For the first time, its strength seemed to falter, its legs shaking visibly under the weight of exhaustion and the relentless pull of the current. Someone in the crowd whispered, "It can't go on much longer." The words hung in the air, unspoken fears mirrored in every pair of eyes fixed on the scene. The old trainer stepped closer to the edge of the water, squinting through the rain. His voice, though steady, carried a note of urgency. "It's not just strength keeping that horse going, it's heart. But heart can only carry you so far." His words were meant to prepare them for the worst, but they only seemed to tighten the knot of tension gripping everyone. No one wanted to admit it. But the odds were stacking higher against the animal with every passing moment. The biologist, still rooted to her spot, couldn't tear her eyes away. Her scientific mind tried to analyze the horse's movements, to make sense of what was driving it forward despite the impossible circumstances. Was it sheer willpower? A deep-seated instinct for survival? Or was it something else entirely, something intangible, something that defied logic? She had studied animals all her life, but this felt different. It wasn't just biology at play here. It was something bigger. A sudden movement in the water snapped everyone's attention back to the horse. A large piece of debris, a broken tree limb, heavy and jagged, hurtled toward it, carried by the unforgiving current. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the danger became clear. The branch was moving fast, too fast, and the horse was directly in its path. There was no time to warn it, no way to intervene. The farmer's breath caught in his throat as he watched, helpless, his worst fears about to unfold. But the horse, as if sensing the danger, turned its head sharply. Its ears pinned back, and in a split-second decision, it shifted its weight and moved sideways, narrowly avoiding the branch as it crashed into the water where it had just stood. The crowd erupted into cheers, their relief palpable, but the tension quickly returned. The horse had avoided disaster this time, but the flood was full of unseen threats, each one capable of ending the fight in an instant. The farmer wiped rain from his face, his hands trembling. He had seen the look in the horse's eyes just before it moved, a flash of awareness, of decision-making. It was thinking, just as the trainer had said. It wasn't simply reacting to the world around it, it was calculating, choosing its next move with a precision that sent a shiver down his spine. He'd always known the horse was special, but this was something else entirely. The rain began to pound harder, the sound a relentless drumbeat against the earth. The water had risen higher still, now nearly touching the horse's shoulders. The crowd grew more anxious, their murmurs blending with the storm. Some whispered prayers, while others simply watched in stunned silence, unable to look away. The horse's movements were slower now, its body straining against the relentless pull of the current. Every step seemed to take an eternity, and with each one, the question loomed larger: how much longer could it last? The boy clinging to his mother's hand tugged at her sleeve, his voice barely audible over the noise. "It's not giving up, is it?" His mother, her throat tight with emotion, shook her head. "No," she said, though her voice wavered. It's not giving up. But even as she said the words, she couldn't shake the fear that the horse's incredible willpower might not be enough. The trainer, now standing at the edge of the water, called out, his voice cutting through the storm. Easy now. Take your time. His words weren't commands, they were encouragements, as if he believed the horse could understand him. And maybe it could. The animal's ears flicked back briefly, and for a moment, it seemed to hesitate, almost as if it had heard him. The biologist stepped closer to the farmer, her voice low but urgent. That horse is extraordinary, she said. It's doing things no animal should be able to do in a situation like this. If it makes it out, it's going to change how people see animals, how they understand what they're capable of. The farmer didn't respond, his focus entirely on the horse. But her words stayed with him, echoing in the back of his mind. Another surge of water hit the horse, nearly knocking it off balance. It staggered but recovered, its muscles visibly trembling with the effort. The crowd gasped again, their collective anxiety almost unbearable. The farmer found himself stepping closer to the edge, his boots sinking into the mud. Come on, he whispered again, his voice thick with emotion. Just a little further. The horse paused, its body heaving with exertion. Its head turned slightly, and for a moment, it seemed to look directly at the farmer. Their eyes met, and in that brief connection, the farmer felt something he couldn't explain, a sense of understanding, of shared determination. It was as if the horse was telling him, I'm not done yet. The rain continued to pour, the wind howling like a living thing. The horse took another step, and another, each one a victory against the forces trying to drag it down. The crowd watched in breathless anticipation, their hearts pounding as the animal inched closer to what felt like the breaking point. Every movement, every decision, seemed to carry the weight of something far greater than survival. It was a fight not just for its life, but for something deeper, something that connected everyone who stood there, watching, unable to look away. The floodwaters roared around the horse, the current growing fiercer with every passing second. The tension was unbearable, the air thick with the collective weight of fear, hope, and something that felt almost like awe. And as the horse prepared to take its next step, the crowd braced themselves, knowing they were about to witness a moment that would stay with them forever one way or another. The horse shifted its weight, bracing itself against the powerful current as another wave of water crashed into its side. The tension in the air was almost suffocating, the crowd's collective energy radiating a mixture of hope and dread. It was clear to everyone that the animal's strength was nearly spent. The farmer could see the trembling in its legs growing worse, its breaths coming in ragged bursts that matched the heaving of its chest. Every second stretched into what felt like hours, the storm raging on with no sign of relenting. And then, something changed. It wasn't immediately obvious, just a subtle shift in the current, a movement beneath the water's surface that seemed almost unnatural. The horse froze, its ears pricking forward, its body suddenly taut. The crowd didn't notice at first, too focused on its struggle to see the way the animal's attention had shifted. But the farmer saw it, his heart dropping like a stone. The horse wasn't just fighting the flood anymore. Something else was out there. The realization hit like a thunderclap as a piece of jagged debris surfaced just a few feet from the horse. It wasn't just another branch or broken plank, it was an entire section of a fence, its wooden beams splintered and sharp, tangled with barbed wire. The current carried it with terrifying speed, the twisted metal gleaming even in the dim light of the storm. It was heading straight for the horse. A ripple of panic spread through the crowd as more people began to notice the new threat. Someone shouted, their voice barely audible over the roar of the water, but it was too late to warn the horse. The jagged fence was almost on top of it, and the animal had no way to escape. The farmer felt his knees buckle, his breath catching in his throat as he braced for the inevitable. But then, in a moment that defied all logic, the horse moved. With a sudden burst of energy, it surged forward, its body twisting to avoid the debris. The crowd gasped as the fence missed the horse by inches, the barbed wire slicing through the air where it had just been. It was a miraculous display of agility and awareness, but the relief was short-lived. The fence slammed into a nearby tree, shattering on impact and sending shards of wood and metal flying into the water. The current carried the wreckage in every direction, creating an even greater danger for the struggling animal. The horse hesitated for the first time, its body trembling as it seemed to weigh its options. The barbed wire was now tangled in the water around it, invisible traps waiting to snag its legs or cut into its skin. The farmer felt a cold dread settle in his chest as he realized the horse's situation had gone from dire to nearly impossible. He could see the animal's muscles quivering, its body screaming for rest even as its mind fought to keep going. The crowd was silent now, their earlier murmurs replaced by an overwhelming sense of helplessness. The biologist stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could barely bring herself to watch, her mind racing with everything she knew about animal behavior and survival instincts. This horse had defied every expectation so far, but now it was facing something no amount of strength or intelligence could overcome. She glanced at the farmer, who was standing frozen at the edge of the water, his face a mask of anguish. "It's trapped," she said softly, though the words felt like a betrayal. "There's no way out." But even as she spoke, the horse moved again. It lifted its head, its ears flicking back as though listening to something only it could hear. The trainer, still standing nearby, narrowed his eyes. "It's thinking," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not done yet." The horse began to shift, testing the water around it with careful movements. It seemed to be feeling for something, its legs probing the depths as though searching for a path through the debris. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their breath held as the animal inched forward. Each step was agonizingly slow, every movement deliberate. The barbed wire was everywhere now, invisible traps waiting to ensnare it, but the horse seemed to sense the danger. It moved with a kind of precision that no one could explain, avoiding the wreckage by what felt like pure instinct or something more. The farmer's hands were shaking as he watched, his heart pounding in his chest. He wanted to believe the horse could make it, that it could somehow defy the odds one more time. But the danger was growing by the second. Another wave of debris was heading downstream. And this time it wasn't just wood and wire. A large piece of metal roofing, sharp and twisted, was spinning in the current, its edges gleaming like knives. The farmer felt a wave of nausea wash over him. If the horse didn't find a way out soon, there wouldn't be anything left to save. The horse paused again, its head turning toward the farmer. For a moment, their eyes met, and the farmer felt that strange connection again, stronger than before. It was as if the horse was trying to tell him something, a silent message carried across the churning water. And then, without warning, the horse surged forward, its legs moving with a speed and precision that seemed impossible for an animal so exhausted. The crowd erupted into shouts and gasps as the horse navigated the debris with breathtaking agility, its movements almost too quick to follow. It was heading toward the far side of the flooded field, where the water was slightly shallower and the current less intense. The trainer's voice rang out over the noise, his tone filled with awe. "It's found a way!" he shouted. "It's going for the high ground." But the danger wasn't over yet. The metal roofing was still hurtling downstream, spinning wildly as it closed in on the horse's path. The crowd watched in horror, their voices rising in a chaotic mix of warnings and prayers. The horse couldn't see the threat, it was too focused on its escape. The farmer felt his legs move before he even realized what he was doing, his body propelling him toward the edge of the water. "Watch out!" he shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. The horse's ears flicked back at the sound of his voice, but it didn't slow down. It kept moving, its body straining against the current as it pushed toward the shallows. The metal roofing was almost on top of it now, the jagged edges spinning dangerously close. The farmer's chest felt like it might explode as he watched, helpless, his shout drowned out by the roar of the flood. And then, just as the roofing seemed destined to collide with the horse, something extraordinary happened. A sudden gust of wind swept across the field, catching the metal and sending it spinning off course. It slammed into a tree with a deafening crash, the impact sending shards of debris flying but leaving the horse untouched. The crowd erupted into cheers and cries of disbelief, their relief palpable. The farmer collapsed to his knees, his hands gripping the muddy ground as he struggled to process what he had just seen. The horse didn't stop. It kept moving, its focus unshaken as it pushed toward the high ground. The biologist wiped rain from her face, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's going to make it," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and disbelief. "It's actually going to make it." But even as the horse neared the shallows, the storm showed no sign of mercy. The water was rising faster now, and the current was stronger than ever. The debris in the flood wasn't the only danger anymore. The sheer force of the water was enough to pull down anything in its path. The horse's struggle was far from over, and the crowd knew it. The stakes had never been higher, and every second felt like a lifetime as they watched, waiting for the next twist in a story that had already defied all expectations. The horse pushed forward, each step a battle against the rushing waters that seemed determined to claim it. The crowd was no longer murmuring or shouting, they were completely silent, their collective breath held as if even the slightest sound might tip the balance. The shallow ground was so close now, just a few more feet, but the current was relentless, pulling harder with every step. The horse's legs quivered under the strain, its body slick with rain and mud, yet it kept moving, refusing to give in. The farmer was kneeling by the water's edge, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Every fiber of his being was willing the horse forward, silently pleading for it to take just one more step, and then another. He could feel the tension radiating from the crowd behind him, their shared hope and fear pressing down like the weight of the storm itself. This wasn't just about the horse anymore. It was about everything the animal had come to represent: courage, resilience, and the unyielding fight against impossible odds. The biologist's voice broke the silence, soft but filled with urgency. "It's almost there," she said, more to herself than anyone else. But even as she spoke, her trained eyes caught something no one else had noticed. The water near the shallows was moving strangely, churning in a way that didn't match the rest of the current. Her stomach dropped as the realization hit her. There was something beneath the surface, something dangerous. Before she could warn anyone, the horse stepped into the turbulent patch of water. The ground beneath it shifted violently, the hidden threat revealing itself in an instant. A deep sinkhole had formed in the flood, the force of the current carving out a pocket of loose mud and debris that was now pulling the horse down. The animal struggled, its body sinking as its legs flailed, trying to find solid footing that wasn't there. The crowd erupted into panic, their earlier hope dissolving into shouts of despair. The farmer didn't think he acted. Without hesitation, he plunged into the water, the cold shocking his system but doing nothing to stop him. He could hear voices calling after him, warning him to stay back, but he ignored them. His focus was solely on the horse, its wide, terrified eyes locked onto his as it fought to stay above the surface. The current was stronger than he'd anticipated, nearly knocking him off his feet as he waded closer. His boots sank into the mud, the pull of the sinkhole threatening to drag him down as well. "Hold on!" he shouted, though he knew the horse couldn't understand him. Still, he kept moving, his hands outstretched as he neared the struggling animal. The horse thrashed, its movements growing more frantic as it sank deeper into the churning water. The farmer's heart felt like it might burst from his chest, but he refused to stop. He wasn't going to let this happen. Not now. Not after everything. Finally, he reached the horse. Grabbing hold of its mane, He used every ounce of strength he had to pull it toward him. The animal's panic was palpable, its massive body surging against him, but he held on, his feet digging into the unstable ground as he fought to keep them both steady. The trainer's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. "Get the rope! Now!" A group of people scrambled to obey, rushing to retrieve a thick rope from the back of a nearby truck. The trainer himself waded into the water, the rope slung over his shoulder as he approached the farmer and the horse. Together, they worked quickly, looping the rope around the horse's chest and securing it tightly. The trainer turned back to the crowd, his voice ringing out above the storm. "Pull! All of you, pull!" Dozens of hands grabbed hold of the rope, their collective strength combining into one desperate effort. The horse heaved, its body straining as the crowd pulled with everything they had. The farmer and the trainer stayed in the water, guiding the animal as it began to rise out of the sinkhole. The current fought back, the water surging around them, but they didn't stop. Inch by inch, the horse emerged, its legs finding solid ground at last. The crowd erupted into cheers as the horse staggered onto the shallows, its body trembling but upright. The farmer collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving as relief washed over him. The trainer clapped him on the back, his face breaking into a rare smile. "You did it," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved it." But just as the relief began to settle over the group, the unexpected happened. The horse, despite its exhaustion, lifted its head and let out a loud, piercing whinny. The sound carried over the storm, cutting through the cheers and silencing the crowd. Everyone turned to look, their eyes following the horse's gaze. On the far side of the flooded field, barely visible through the rain, was another horse. The second horse stood on a patch of higher ground, its body soaked but steady. It let out a whinny in return, the sound filled with urgency. The farmer's breath caught in his throat as he realized what was happening. The first horse hadn't been fighting for its own survival, it had been trying to reach the other horse all along. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the exhausted horse began to move again, its steps slow but determined. The farmer wanted to stop it, to tell it to rest, but he knew he couldn't. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. The two horses met in the shallows, their noses touching briefly in a gesture that was both tender and triumphant. The crowd erupted into cheers once more, the sound carrying over the storm like a wave of pure emotion. The farmer felt tears streaming down his face, mixing with the rain, but he didn't care. In that moment, nothing else mattered. As the storm began to subside, the two horses stood side by side, their bodies leaning into each other, as if drawing strength from their shared connection. The farmer looked at them, his chest swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. They had survived, not just because of their strength, but because of their bond, because they refused to give up on each other. And as the crowd slowly began to disperse, their hearts full of awe and wonder, the farmer couldn't shake the feeling that he had witnessed something truly extraordinary. Something that would stay with him for the rest of his life, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope and determination could light the way. The storm finally broke as the first light of dawn pushed its way through the heavy clouds. The wind calmed, the rain softened to a drizzle, and the swollen floodwaters began to recede, leaving behind a muddy, battered landscape that told the story of the night's chaos. The two horses stood quietly together now, their bodies pressed close as if they knew the danger had passed. Their breaths came slow and steady, their heads hanging low but not from defeat, from an exhaustion that spoke of survival. The farmer stood not far from them, his boots sinking slightly into the saturated ground as he watched the animals with a kind of reverence. His clothes were soaked, and his muscles ached from the effort of the rescue, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that they had made it. Both of them. He couldn't explain how he knew it, but it felt important that the horses had survived together, as if their connection had been the thread holding everything together when the night was at its darkest. The biologist approached him, her face drawn but calm. She had spent the last few minutes checking the horses from a distance, looking for signs of injury or distress. "They're remarkable," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the gentle murmur of the receding water. "To endure all of that and still have the strength to stand." She glanced at the farmer, her eyes searching his face. "You should be proud." The farmer nodded, though words didn't come easily to him. Proud wasn't the right word, it was something deeper than that, something he didn't quite know how to put into words. He wiped his face with a trembling hand, brushing away the mix of rain and tears that clung to his skin. "They saved each other," he said finally, his voice thick. "I thought we were the ones saving them, but they never gave up on each other. That's what kept them going." The biologist smiled faintly, her gaze returning to the horses. "It's a bond you don't see every day. It's rare, even in the wild. Whatever brought them together. It's something we'll probably never fully understand." The trainer joined them, his steps slow and deliberate as he approached. He looked exhausted, his usually sharp eyes softened with relief. "They'll be okay," he said, more of a statement than a question. "They're strong. Stronger than any of us gave them credit for." The farmer turned to him, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he extended a hand, his grip firm and steady as they shook. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "Without all of you." He looked around at the remaining crowd, the faces of neighbors, friends, and strangers who had come together in the storm's worst moments. "Thank you? All of you?" The trainer nodded, his usual stoicism giving way to a rare moment of emotion. "We do what we can," he said simply, but there was weight in his words. They all knew how close they had come to losing everything. And yet, somehow, they had prevailed. As the morning unfolded, the horses were led to drier ground, their steps slow but steady. The farmer stayed close, his hands gentle as he guided them, speaking softly to reassure them. They seemed to respond to his presence, their trust in him unshaken despite the night's ordeal. It was a bond forged in the fire of shared struggle, unbreakable in a way that transcended words. The rest of the day was a blur of cleanup and reflection. The floodwaters had left their mark on the land, washing away fences, uprooting trees, and scattering debris across the fields. But the damage seemed insignificant compared to what could have been lost. The horses were safe. That was all that mattered. The biologist lingered for a while, jotting down notes and observing the animals from a distance. She promised to return in the coming days to check on their recovery, her curiosity piqued by their resilience. The trainer stayed long enough to ensure the horses were settled before quietly taking his leave, his work done for now. As the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of gold and orange, the farmer sat on a fallen log near the paddock, watching the two horses graze. They moved slowly, their energy spent, but there was a peace in their movements that hadn't been there before. It was as if they knew they had survived something extraordinary, something that would forever bond them. A neighbor approached, carrying a thermos of coffee and a look of quiet admiration. "You've got yourself a couple of miracles there," she said, handing him the thermos. "Not just the horses, but everything you all did. It's a story people will be talking about for a long time." The farmer accepted the coffee with a small smile, his gaze never leaving the horses. "They're the miracles," he said simply. "We just helped them along the way." As night fell, the world seemed to settle into a calm that felt almost foreign after the chaos of the storm. The stars emerged one by one, their light reflected in the still pools of water that dotted the landscape. The farmer stood at the edge of the paddock, his hands resting on the fence, as he watched the horses settle down for the night. The larger one, the one they had fought so hard to save, lay down in the grass, its head resting near the other. It was a simple, quiet moment, but it carried a weight that the farmer felt deep in his chest. He thought about everything that had happened, about the storm, the flood, and the desperation that had gripped them all. But more than that, he thought about the courage of the horses, their refusal to give up, and the way they had leaned on each other when it mattered most. It wasn't just a story of survival. It was a story of connection, of loyalty, and of the unbreakable bond between two beings who understood each other in a way no one else could. As he turned to head back to the house, the farmer felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. The storm had taken its toll, but it had also reminded him of something important, something he would carry with him for the rest of his days. No matter how fierce the storm, no matter how high the waters rise, there is always a way forward. And sometimes, all it takes is the strength to trust, to fight, and to hold on to the ones who matter most.